For over 2,000 years, it set standards in science, philosophy, warfare, art, and bureaucracy. But don't romanticize it too quickly. Because as breathtaking as the Forbidden City might seem from afar, if you lived there, your life would have been anything but glamorous. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to Imperial China, where the moment you exit the womb, society politely hands you a roll, and then nails it shut. Think of the social system like a multi-tiered cake, except you're the stale bottom layer, and the frosting never trickles down. At the very top, the Emperor, also known as the Son of Heaven, which is a lovely title until you realize heaven doesn't take complaints. He rules by the mandate of heaven, meaning as long as the crops grow and rebellions stay quiet, his divine status remains unchallenged. If things go wrong, welp, guess heaven changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Beneath him sit the scholar officials, men who spent most of their lives memorizing Confucian texts, quoting philosophy no one asked for, and developing hunched backs from a lifetime of bamboo scrolls and social superiority. They passed the imperial exams, which were essentially the SATs if failing meant dying poor forever. Next are the farmers. Yes, the muddy, sun-scorched, underfed backbone of society. Confucian doctrine actually respected them. They fed the empire, after all. Unfortunately, respect doesn't come with dental care or lunch breaks. Then come artisans, the people who made stuff with their hands. Paper, porcelain, fans, frustration. Useful? Absolutely. Respected? Not so much. But hey, at least they weren't merchants. Ah, merchants. Richer than everyone, trusted by no one. According to Confucian values, making a profit off other people's labor was morally slippery. So you could be dripping in silk and silver, but still be treated like a tax-evading raccoon in a brocade robe. Then we reach the societal basement. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Basically anyone you wouldn't want to sit next to at a formal banquet. Oh, and monks? Somewhere in a grey area between holy man and why are you bald and barefoot in public? And finally, women. Not even on the pyramid. They were more like the gravel surrounding it. Born to obey their fathers, handed off to obey their husbands, and expected to produce sons who could someday obey more men. So if you were born in Imperial China and hoped to follow your dreams, society had one answer. That's adorable. Now get back to work. Your day in Imperial China starts bright and early, not because you're a morning person, but because the rooster is screaming and the village bell is clanging like it's trying to summon the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch your limbs, and then immediately remember you're not allowed to just exist. First, you bow. Not to some abstract deity or noble ideal, to your dad. Then your mum. Then your grandpa. Possibly to your great-aunt if she's still breathing. This is filial piety, and it's not just encouraged, it's mandatory. Forget to bow? That's not being rude. That's inviting cosmic shame onto 7 generations of your bloodline. And you don't just bow once. You bow in stages. You bow when you wake up. You bow before eating. You bow when someone older than you coughs in your direction. If you're not bowing at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now, say you accidentally speak out of turn during morning tea. Maybe you asked a question like, "Why do I have to wash Uncle's feet?" Well, congratulations. You've now committed unfilial conduct, which is one small notch above public arson in terms of social disgrace. Better start rehearsing your apology, with 3 full kowtows and an optional forehead-to-floor touch. And yes, the furniture is judging you too. Most households didn't have chairs unless they were rich, so you're kneeling on woven mats, trying not to collapse while your elders launch into 45-minute monologues about respect, discipline, and how the world went downhill ever since the last dynasty. Let's not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint slide that dictates who gets to talk, sit, or breathe first. Age beats youth. Men outrank women. Fathers outrank everyone. Even among siblings, older ones can talk over you. If you're the youngest, just nod, smile, and hope you're not blamed for something someone else did. There is no good morning in Imperial China. There is only a series of respectful rituals and a quiet prayer that today you won't accidentally offend someone and get disowned. You've bowed approximately 47 times before 7 a.m. Congratulations, you've survived the opening ceremony of the day. Now it's time for breakfast, the most important meal of the day, to remind you that life is suffering. So what's on the menu? Let's see. A steaming bowl of rice gruel, also known as congee, which is a generous way of saying hot, wet nothing. It's made by boiling rice in water until the rice gives up and becomes soup. If you're lucky, it has a little salt. If you're really lucky, a stray sliver of pickled vegetable floats by like a rare koi. If your family is on the poorer end of the spectrum, and let's face it, you are, that bowl of congee is about as exciting as your social prospects. You eat it quietly, respectfully, and under the silent judgment of at least one grandparent who remembers when even gruel was a luxury. Meat? Don't even ask. That's for festivals, weddings, and imperial officials who haven't visited a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are possible, but they're usually preserved in salt or ash until they resemble fossilized sadness. If someone brings out pork belly, you immediately check for visiting relatives or divine intervention. Tea is served, of course, not for relaxation, but because plain water is suspect. Tea, at least, has been boiled, and thus statistically less likely to kill you. You sip it slowly, even though your stomach is still wondering when the meal actually started. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals are not for chatter. You don't discuss dreams, goals, or how you cried last night thinking about the imperial exam. You eat facing the ancestral shrine, silently thankful for your ancestors, even if they left you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and impossible family expectations. The bowls are rough ceramic. The spoons are made of wood. There is no napkin. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve, if it's clean enough, and get ready to start working off the meal you barely consumed. And as you rise, your father nods once. Eat quickly. Heaven favours the diligent. Which roughly translates to, get back to work. We've got dynasties to maintain. You've finished your bowl of existential porridge, and now it's time to get dressed. Not to impress, but to not get fined, flogged, or mistaken for a social class above your station. Because in Imperial China, what you wear isn't about self-expression. It's about survival. Let's start with fabric hierarchy. Are you a farmer? Hemp. Coarse, itchy, scratchy hemp, the medieval equivalent of wearing a potato sack dipped in disappointment. Are you a noble? Silk. Glorious, shimmering silk that flows like poetry and whispers, tax the peasants more. And guess what? If you're caught wearing the wrong fabric, you're not just unfashionable, you're committing a crime. Clothing wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was law. The government had detailed regulations on sleeve width, hat shape, belt ornaments, and even colour. Yellow, for instance, was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wear yellow as a commoner, and you're not starting a fashion trend, you're starting your own execution. Let's talk footwear. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practicality? Optional. Comfort? Unlikely. You didn't dress for the weather, you dressed for the dynasty, and now, the feet. Specifically, foot binding, the aesthetic equivalent of turning your toes into a curled-up secret. If you were a high-born girl, your feet were broken, folded under, and bound tightly from the age of 5. Why? because tiny deformed feet, called lotus feet, were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by how effectively she could hobble across a room without falling. It wasn't just painful, it was permanent, foot-binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into an act of art and agony. But don't worry. At least you got to wear embroidered shoes no one ever saw, because walking far wasn't really an option anymore. Even men didn't escape wardrobe misery. Bureaucrats wore heavy layered robes year-round, even in summer, because status always outranked sweat. Some outfits even had winged hat flaps, designed to keep officials from whispering to each other during court. So yes, Imperial Chinese fashion was elegant, symbolic, and deeply political. But it also chafed, pinched, overheated, or outright shattered your bones. Beauty is pain, they say. But here, pain was mandatory, and beauty was a government-approved dress code. You're now properly dressed in your socially acceptable potato fibre tunic. Great. Time to head out and earn your daily calories, assuming the land, weather, and taxes allow it. Let's be honest. In Imperial China, work wasn't a calling. It was a never-ending endurance test designed by Confucius and enforced by people who've never touched a shovel in their lives. If you're a farmer, and statistically, you are, you'll spend your entire life bent over a rice paddy. Not in a poetic, cinematic way. No, this is literal back-breaking labour. You wake up before the sun, plant seedlings knee-deep in muck, swat away mosquitoes the size of small birds, and pray the landlord doesn't increase your grain tax again this year. Rain? You work. Drought? You work harder. Locusts? Work and scream at the sky simultaneously. The tools are basic. A wooden plough if you're lucky, your bare hands if you're not. Your ox is your best friend and your retirement plan. Lose him, and it's just you versus 10 acres of disappointment. Now, let's say you're a woman. Your workload has a sequel. You'll help in the fields and cook, clean, spin thread, weave fabric, raise children, and somehow still be blamed when dinner is late or your husband sneezes wrong. Rest? That's something noble ladies do while debating poetry. Artisans don't have it much better. You spend hours making pottery, paper, or tools by hand, then sell them for barely enough to buy stale tofu. And merchants, technically richer, but socially shamed. You could buy half the village and still be treated like a walking moral failure. Then there's corvée labour, government-mandated service. One day the emperor may need a new road, canal, or tomb. Guess who's helping build it for free with a smile and no shoes? You. Refuse and you're branded a criminal, or worse, a rebel. And at the end of it all, you trudge home, covered in dirt, to a bowl of thin porridge and the quiet satisfaction of not dying today. In Imperial China, work doesn't set you free. It just keeps you too tired to rebel. Ah, the imperial exam system, the grand gateway to upward mobility. Or, as it's more accurately known, the eternal written torture chamber of China. If you were a man born with a sliver of ambition and a family slightly wealthier than dirt, your life path was clear. Pass the civil service exam, succeed, and you'd become an official. Respected, powerful, with silk robes and actual chairs to sit on. Fail? Back to the rice fields, peasant. Simple? Not even close. These exams were less multiple choice, and more memorize the entire Confucian canon word for word, and write poetic essays that would make a 1,000-year-old ghost weep. Imagine being judged not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flows like a morally upright river. One smudge, one character out of place, one metaphor too edgy, instant failure. Studying began in early childhood and didn't stop until your hairline did. Boys crammed inside freezing study huts or boiled themselves alive in summer, scribbling out essays until their fingers curled permanently into brush-holding claws. Tutors drilled doctrine into your skull like academic blacksmiths. Your social life? Gone. Your hobbies? Confucius. Your dreams? Still Confucius. The top exam, the Jinshi, was held in the capital. You were locked in a cubicle the size of a coffin with nothing but paper, ink, and soul-crushing anxiety. You brought your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some examinees fainted, others went mad. A few died, yes, literally died from the pressure, and they weren't even given partial credit. Even if you passed the first round, more exams awaited. District, provincial, national. Years could go by. Decades. Some men tested into their 60s. One guy reportedly took the exam more than 40 times. That's not determination. That's trauma with a calligraphy pen. And if you failed? Social shame. Your family, who sacrificed everything for your education, would be disappointed, and loudly so. Your neighbours would whisper. Your mother might cry. Your father might give you the look. You know the one. The "why weren't you born smarter?" stare. So yes, the exam could lift you to greatness, or break your mind, your body, and your lineage. All for the chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace eunuchs. Worth it? That's up to Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Don't worry, you will. Because in Imperial China, personal hygiene wasn't so much a lifestyle as it was a seasonal suggestion. Let's start with the basics. Bathing? It happened, sometimes. Maybe once every few weeks if you were lucky and not freezing to death. In summer, sure. A dip in the river. In winter? You might go a month without a proper wash. And no, there was no lavender-scented soap. Soap, when used, was made from animal fat and ashes, a gritty blend that felt like exfoliating with misery. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities. But privacy wasn't really a thing. You'd be scrubbing your armpits next to an elderly merchant and a shrieking toddler, while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Refreshing. Toothpaste? Try salt, charcoal, or powdered bones. Toothbrushes were made from animal hair tied to bamboo. Effective only if your goal was to mildly disturb your plaque into relocating. Dental hygiene wasn't great, which is probably why most older adults smiled like haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites. Lice, fleas, bedbugs. These were less pests and more roommates. It didn't matter how rich you were. If you had hair, you had company. Comb shops flourished because everyone needed a lice comb. And if you didn't? You scratched your scalp like you were trying to summon lightning. Clothing wasn't helping. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and praying your shirt didn't disintegrate into fibres. Underwear existed, but wasn't a daily requirement, especially for peasants, who often wore none at all. Risky business. And don't forget the toilets. Or actually do, for your own sake. A toilet was typically a hole in the ground, occasionally surrounded by wooden boards if you were fancy. Public latrines, functional in the same way a haunted well is functional. Smelly, crowded, and always one step away from biological disaster. Imperial China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces. But if you wanted a long, hot, private shower, you were about 1,500 years too early. So you've survived the lice, the breakfast disappointment, and the soul-crushing exam prep. But before you even think about complaining to your neighbour, remember, in Imperial China, the law is always watching. And unlike modern surveillance, this one comes with bamboo sticks and very creative punishments. Let's begin with the legal code. Imperial dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Qing periods, were known for having exhaustively detailed laws. There were laws about taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, how to grieve properly, and how long you were allowed to mourn your in-laws. Accidentally wear the wrong colour on the wrong festival day? Technically criminal. And yes, they kept receipts. Official bamboo strip records, inked and filed by overworked scribes who probably hated their job. Punishment wasn't subtle. Forget modern courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice believed in education through suffering. For minor offences, you might get flogged with a bamboo rod. Fun fact, the court even had different sizes of sticks depending on the crime. Light insult, small stick, stole a chicken, bigger stick. Failed to bow deeply enough to a magistrate's horse, surprise stick combo. For more serious crimes, things escalated quickly. You could be branded, tattooed on the face with your crime, sent into exile, or, if you really upset someone important, executed in public, slowly. Torture wasn't an exception, it was procedure. If you were accused of something, the court would often help encourage your confession with thumbscrews, kneeling on spiked boards, or long hours in a stress position while being shouted at by a man with a scroll and no sense of humour. And here's the best part. You didn't even have to be guilty, just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unlucky. Even your family could be held accountable. The law loved collective punishment. If your cousin said something seditious during a rice wine binge, you might wake up to find your house under investigation, because guilt, apparently, was hereditary. The law was structured. It was advanced. It was terrifying. Justice in Imperial China was less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear. Behave. Respect the order. And whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the magistrate's concubine. Welcome to the imperial justice system's favourite hobby, torture, not as a punishment, but as a handy pre-trial icebreaker. Let's say someone accuses you of stealing a chicken, disrespecting your father, or, heaven forbid, expressing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The magistrate doesn't start by asking for your side of the story. No, this is Imperial China. You start by getting tied to a bench while they bring out the confession toolkit. First up, the bamboo rod, used for beating your back, buttocks, or thighs, until you're sorry for crimes you may not even understand. It wasn't random violence. They kept official punishment logs, counting every stroke with bureaucratic precision. 30 lashes for theft, 45 for lying, 1 bonus lash for squirming. Still denying guilt? Time to upgrade. Kneeling on spiked boards was a classic. You kneel on rough wood embedded with stones or glass until your legs give out, or your will does. It's a little like yoga, if yoga were invented by angry civil servants. Then there's the finger crusher. 2 slabs of wood tightened with rope around your fingers. Fun fact, it was called the small tiger bench, which sounds adorable until your bones snap like kindling. It's hard to write a confession with broken fingers, but they didn't really care about penmanship. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture wasn't seen as morally questionable. It was simply the most efficient way to get the truth, or at least a version of it that matched the official narrative. If you still wouldn't confess, they'd just escalate. Some punishments involved being stretched, whipped, or left tied up in the summer sun while officials took a lunch break. And don't bother screaming, the neighbours are used to it. Now imagine you're innocent. Congratulations. You still get tortured, because a clean confession was needed for proper record keeping. Better to admit to something than risk being labelled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, remember, at least the DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you admit you might have parked improperly in 1372. You may think you're alone, but in Imperial China, someone is always watching. And no, it's not just your judgmental grandmother. The surveillance state wasn't digital. It was human, carefully trained, state-approved, and terrifyingly thorough. It began at the village level, where every town had a local baozhang or village elder who wasn't just there to hand out rice. He was also your friendly neighbourhood informant. Your neighbours? Also spies? Your extended family? Absolutely spies. Your servant who claims to be illiterate and deaf? Definitely a spy. People were incentivized to report suspicious behaviour, and suspicious could mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute speech. Even staying too quiet could raise eyebrows. What are you hiding, citizen? In the cities, you had a sophisticated network of yamen runners, scribes, and magistrate assistants whose job was to investigate crimes, deliver messages, and casually observe everything you did. Every dynasty had its own version of this machine, but the goal remained the same. Keep the peace by peeking through every available crack. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the imperial palace, those castrated courtiers who couldn't father children but absolutely could start coups. Many controlled their own secret police forces, operated spy rings, and whispered in the ears of emperors. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers, simply by knowing who said what to whom and when. And don't even try complaining about the system. Criticizing the emperor, even indirectly, like saying, "The sun looks a little tired today," could be interpreted as slander. Poets learned to master the art of subtlety. Everyone else just mastered the art of shutting up. What's worse, the government often published lists of executed criminals as a warning, complete with names and crimes. It was like an ancient Facebook feed, but with more beheadings. So if you had a rebellious thought, you kept it to yourself. If you had a rebellious cousin, you turned him in. And if someone smiled too wide while asking about your political opinions, that was your cue to fake a cough and run. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears. And so did the trees, the neighbours, and probably your rice bowl. In Imperial China, marriage was not about falling in love under the cherry blossoms. It was about duty, negotiation, and dowries so heavy they could break your ox cart's axle. Love? That was for poems, not people. Let's start with the basics. Marriages were arranged, always. Parents decided your fate while you were still learning how to hold chopsticks. If your family had status, they'd hire a matchmaker, a professional snoop who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had ever done anything embarrassing 5 dynasties ago. If everything aligned, congratulations, you're engaged, to someone you've probably never met. Physical attraction, personality, shared interests, irrelevant. Compatibility was measured in birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage wasn't an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping with ceremonial robes. You left your family forever, changed your surname, and moved into your husband's home, where you were now expected to serve not only him, but his parents, his grandparents, and whatever cranky uncle happened to be living in the guest room. The dowry system meant your family had to send money, goods, or land with you. The more, the better. Think of it as ancient China's version of "thanks for taking her off our hands." In return, the groom's family might give betrothal gifts, but don't get too excited. Sometimes that meant silks and jewellery. Other times, a slightly nicer chicken. Once married, your job was clear. Produce male heirs, obey your in-laws, and never, ever talk back. A wife was expected to be modest, silent, and hard-working, the holy trinity of Confucian womanhood. If you were too loud, too opinionated, or, heaven forbid, barren, you might get replaced, legally, with a concubine. Speaking of which, yes, concubinage was a thing. Men could take multiple concubines, especially if they were rich. Women. One man, one shot at survival. Divorce? Rare. Social suicide. The only acceptable grounds were 7 outs, including jealousy, disease, or excessive gossip. So if your tea-drinking habits annoyed your husband enough, he could legally dump you. Nice. In short, marriage in Imperial China was less happily ever after, and more try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. So, you're thinking of rebelling. Maybe you're tired of back-breaking labour, endless bowing, or that smug magistrate who taxed your rice and your dignity in the same afternoon. Bold move. Unfortunately, in Imperial China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It made you a very short-lived headline. Let's start with the fantasy. You gather a ragtag band of peasants, burn your landlord's tax ledgers, and proclaim a glorious new era of justice. The problem? The Imperial army arrives 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and no sense of humour. You see, the emperors weren't just bureaucrats in gold hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian ideology taught that rebellion meant disorder, and disorder meant the universe was out of whack. That made you not just a criminal, but a cosmic threat. And the punishment for cosmic threats? Dramatic. You'd be captured, paraded, tortured, and often executed in a way specifically designed to discourage creative thinking. Public beheadings were popular, so was quartering. One emperor preferred slow slicing, a charming method where you were cut repeatedly until your paperwork and your torso were complete. And it didn't stop with you. The imperial government loved a good collective punishment. Your family, your neighbours, even that one guy who once lent you a hoe, they were all fair game. The logic was simple. If we erase your entire village, no one will rebel again. Effective, terrifying. Still, rebellions did happen. From the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the White Lotus Uprising, desperate people occasionally rose up. And while some sparked chaos, most were brutally crushed. The survivors were either enslaved, silenced, or drafted into public works projects they wouldn't survive long enough to finish. Even talking about rebellion was dangerous. Writing a sassy poem that hinted at discontent? Boom. Arrested. Confess under bamboo interrogation. If you're lucky, you get exiled to the outer provinces to think about your actions. Somewhere cold, rocky, and strategically flea-infested. So yes, rebellion sounded romantic, the stuff of dramas and legends. But in reality, you were more likely to become a cautionary tale carved onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Best to keep your head down, literally. So maybe you thought, if I can't make it as a peasant, maybe I'll rise through the ranks, ace the exams, and live a comfortable life as a government official. Adorable. Welcome to court life in Imperial China, where yes, the tea is hot, the robes are silk, and the palace floors are polished to a divine shine. But so are the knives hiding behind everyone's backs. Let's begin with the Forbidden City, the Emperor's heavily guarded wonderland. Inside, everyone is smiling and plotting. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, scholar officials, all locked in a constant game of polite treachery. The only thing more cutthroat than court life was actual throat-cutting, which also happened. A lot. If you were an official, your every move was watched. Not just by spies, but by rivals waiting for you to mess up. File a report with the wrong character? Treason. Mispronounce the emperor's name during a reading? Treason. Hesitate before kneeling? Treason adjacent at the very least. And let's talk about eunuchs, castrated palace servants who wielded disproportionate power. Many started humbly, rose swiftly, and became gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Upset a eunuch? You might find your promotion mysteriously delayed, or your name added to a secret, accidental disappearance list. Meanwhile, the imperial harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a high-stakes political battlefield. Concubines vied for favour, sabotaged rivals, and hoped to birth a prince, preferably one who didn't get poisoned before age 5. The empress might technically be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing to do but scheme creatively. Even poetry was risky. Compose the wrong metaphor about wilting flowers or a crumbling wall, and someone might decide you're criticizing the emperor. There were officials executed for writing poems about the weather, because the emperor took the hint. And when the emperor died... Oh, now the real fun began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition. So no, court life wasn't safer. It was just death in a silk wrapper. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath it. You've made it this far. Bowed, bled, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, and dodged at least 3 types of death. But here's the grand truth about life in Imperial China. You were a statistic, a head count, a line item on a dusty tax ledger. To the empire, you were not a person with hopes and dreams. You were a grain of rice, small, anonymous, easily crushed, and ideally harvested for labor or revenue. The state didn't care if you had ambition, talent, or inner beauty. It cared if your family paid its taxes on time and produced able-bodied sons to draft into the next border defense project. From the emperor's viewpoint, you were one speck among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You weren't the golden imperial seal or a sacred relic. You were a moving part in a rice-producing, silk-spinning, canal-digging machine built to sustain dynastic continuity. Your birth was recorded not for celebration, but for future tax extraction. Your death was noted mostly so your family wouldn't keep trying to claim your rations. And in between, your life's purpose was to not cause problems. Stay in line, fulfill your role, and try not to starve during a drought. Individualism? Cute idea. It didn't exist. You didn't follow your passion. You followed your father, your master, or your assigned bureaucratic rank. The idea of being unique, of standing out, was as threatening to the state as a crop blight or a Mongol invasion. Harmony was everything. Even your emotions were expected to be in line with your social status. Feeling sad as a peasant? Acceptable? Feeling inspired? Sit down. The census didn't ask what your favourite poem was. It asked if your roof leaked and whether you owned a pig. Even your body belonged to the system. Drafted for public works, you might be sent to build a canal you'd never benefit from, or guard a wall you'd never see finished. Die along the way? No problem. There were always more grains where you came from. In Imperial China you mattered, but only as long as you could be counted, taxed, or buried quietly. So here we are, 15 chapters deep. And if you've been paying attention, one thing is clear. Imperial China was magnificent, and magnificently merciless. Yes, this civilization gave the world some of its most profound inventions. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, printing, bureaucracy that actually worked, mostly. The Great Wall snaked across mountains, the Forbidden City stood like a jewel of imperial will, and poetry flowed like the Yellow River. Beautiful, endless, and often fatal if interpreted incorrectly. The legacy? Unmatched. The reality? Backbreaking, hierarchical, and constantly one bad rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant brushstroke recorded in a scholar's diary, there were 10,000 peasants ankle-deep in mud, wondering whether this year's tax grain would leave anything left to eat. For every emperor buried beneath a mountain of jade and gold, there were hundreds of labourers buried beneath the same mountain because they were inconvenient witnesses. The brilliance of Imperial China didn't come cheap. It was paid for in childhoods, lost to exam study, backs bent from fieldwork, and lives cut short by law, famine, or conscription. The system worked, brilliantly, for the top few. For everyone else, it worked them until they collapsed. And the worst part? Most of them accepted it, not because they loved oppression, but because the system had convinced them it was the natural order of things, that heaven had appointed their emperor, that filial piety, obedience and silence were virtues, that suffering quietly was a form of virtue, that legacy, the duality of splendour and suffering, is what still echoes today. When people look back at Imperial China, they often see the calligraphy, the architecture, the philosophical quotes carved into stone. They don't always see the concubine poisoned in the harem, the starving mother selling her comb for rice, or the scholar who failed the exam for the 7th time and simply disappeared. So no, you wouldn't last a day in Imperial China. Not because you're soft, but because that world wasn't built for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control. And yet, through it all, the empire endured. The people endured. But only a few of their stories were ever told. In the spring of 1846, the Great Westward Migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail pulsed with life, oxen trudging, wagon wheels creaking, and families dreaming of new beginnings. Among these travellers was a group of roughly 30 people led by brothers George and Jacob Donner and businessman James F. Reed. They weren't fortune seekers or adventurers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children chasing the promise of California's fertile valleys. Their timing seemed perfect. The snows wouldn't fall for months, and the well-worn path west had carried thousands before them. But the Donner Party, later numbering 87 people, made one critical error that would set them on a path toward tragedy. They chose to take a shortcut. This so-called shortcut was the Hastings Cut-Off, an untested route promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never even travelled it himself with a wagon. It promised to shave weeks off the journey by cutting through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had sent guides ahead to leave letters encouraging emigrants to take his new route. The Donner Party, trusting those letters, left the traditional trail and followed his suggestion. At first, spirits remained high. The group included children, elderly parents, and entire families who sang hymns at night and held tight to hope. But trouble began quickly. The Wasatch Mountains were far more treacherous than Hastings claimed. The wagons had to be dismantled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers flared, supplies dwindled. Then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a brutal, shimmering hell. Hastings had said it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. Water barrels ran dry. Animals collapsed. Oxen went mad. Entire wagons were abandoned in the alkaline dust. They had already lost precious time, and winter was no longer far behind them. By the time they rejoined the main trail, they had lost weeks. Other wagon trains were already over the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pushed onward, unaware that the most harrowing part of their journey still lay ahead. The dream of California was still in their minds, but the mountains didn't care about dreams. And soon, neither would starvation. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was supposed to be the last great obstacle before descending into California's promised lands. But the mountains weren't just high, they were merciless, and winter was arriving early. The party was now fractured. Some families had forged ahead, while others, including the Donners and the Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and sheer exhaustion. Snow began to fall, light at first, then relentless. Within days, the passes became impassable. They were trapped. They camped at Truckee Lake, what's now called Donner Lake, and others stopped further back at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pine logs and wagon parts. They slaughtered their remaining animals. Hides were turned into crude tents. The snow kept falling. Over 6 feet, then 10. The hunger came quickly. Rations were reduced. The livestock was gone. They boiled strips of rawhide and gnawed on leather belts. One child tried to eat a blanket. Another chewed on a piece of bark until their gums bled. Every morning brought another cold body. Death moved slowly, politely, then cruelly. Inside those cabins, there was no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried to comfort starving children. Fathers stared out into the endless snow, calculating how far they might get on foot. Arguments broke out. Hope thinned like the mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the roofs. Trees snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under white silence. The pass was closed. And the dream of California was gone, replaced by a desperate, singular thought: survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest members formed what would be called the Forlorn Hope Party. 10 men and 5 women strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and attempted to cross the mountains on foot, carrying meagre rations and the unbearable burden of what might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the Forlorn Hope, the question wasn't if they would survive. It was, who would die first, and who would eat them? On December 16th, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope, not by the newspapers, but by their fellow emigrants who watched them go, knowing full well what the word forlorn meant: lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could: scraps of dried oxhide, flint, a rifle, and shredded blankets. They built crude snowshoes, hoping to stay above the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They slogged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days, they were lost. The food ran out almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, a pine cone boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest in the group. His daughters sobbed as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonio, the Mexican teamster. Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious. Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death came not as a storm, but as a slow hush. It was silent, white, inescapable. Then came the moment. The line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved meat from their fallen companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It wasn't savagery. It was calculus. Starve or live. Sarah Graves, just 19, later recalled the first taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Mary Ann Graves held her sister's hand and whispered that it didn't matter what they had to do, so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived. 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought something far more powerful than supplies or maps. They brought news. There were dozens still alive, trapped at Donner Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they needed help, now. California, which had largely ignored the Donner mess, suddenly woke up. The horror was too great, the shame too large. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper, and in the cabins by the lake, what they would find was beyond imagining. The first rescue party arrived at Donner Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the Forlorn Hope emerged from the mountains. What they found wasn't a camp. It was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, doors frozen shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Children lay beside their dead parents. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood, and the smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, spoke of what had happened when the meat ran out. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had started the journey, nearly half were dead, and those still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt, skeletal figures wrapped in filthy hides, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescuers had brought supplies, flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to carry dozens through snowdrifts taller than wagons. They had to make impossible decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest. Those with the greatest chance of surviving the trek back down the mountains. Parents stayed behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, unsure if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. Each had to battle whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had swallowed the Donner Party whole. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors, and darker stories. The truth began to leak out, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism. Of how, in the worst nights, when all was lost, some survivors had fed on the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to feed. The names were kept quiet, the rumours louder than the facts. Some were judged, others pitied. Most were simply too traumatised to speak. James Reed, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defence, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him. She stayed behind when the others left and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over. But the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, twisting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. America, gripped by manifest destiny fever, was suddenly staring at its shadow. The story was too irresistible. Pioneers chasing paradise, turned cannibals in the snow. Some headlines called it the cannibal horror of the Sierra. Others accused survivors of murder. It wasn't just scandal, it was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, and inevitable. But now it was stained with the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pinewood fires. Journalists fixated on every ghastly detail. Who ate whom? Who died nobly? And who took too long to die? Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was hounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family.